When we consider an AC field or an AC phenomenon, the effect of a phase relation, a time lag between the voltage component and the current component of an AC sine wave are very easy to manipulate, but the benefits are also very minor. When we get into a DC situation, it is possible to take the Lenz effect and create a similar time lag, a similar drag or phase relation difference over time, which is harder to induce, but the benefits are greater. What I'm alluding to is gravity versus anti-gravity, and the Searle disk is definitely not an AC situation because the rotation of the Searle disk is constant in one direction and the only variable is speed. How quickly does it spin? Well, we have both a magnetic field and an electric field, and it turns out they're not tightly coupled in the absolute sense. There is a little looseness. And I'm suspecting that the Lenz effect is a magnetic drag to the electric inducement, in which when a Searle disk spins, the electric field gets ahead of the magnetic field because the magnetic field drags. It can't keep up. And the faster we spin the Searle disk, the greater is the lag, in which the magnetic field is getting behind the electric field. And the more it gets behind it, the more it levitates, the more it wants to be anti-gravity. Which begs the question, well, how does the Earth create gravity? If we know it has a core of some kind, it has a huge space between the core and its thin shell, so that it's effectively hollow, but it's not entirely hollow because it has something in the center and something at the periphery, constituting its shell. Which then begs the question, well, something contrary to the Searle effect is creating gravity in which the magnetic field is leading the electric field, and the electric field is dragging behind the magnetic field, creating gravity. Now, when we get to Marvin Cole and his work on the E.V. Gray motor, he left E.V. Gray and walked out because he freaked out. His experiments was creating levitation. Now, as I recall, the E.V. Gray motor is a DC motor. It is not an AC motor, which means that he was somehow inducing a magnetic drag sufficiently in time, dragging behind the electric field, to create anti-gravity. And it may not have been based on the Searle mechanism of rotation, of accelerating rotation, but induced by some other method. Now, we know from Mark McKay's analysis that there were interesting adjunct or supplemental supporting mechanisms to try to induce, or increase efficiency way beyond a coefficient of performance of somewhere around 4, which was the core of the device. And it could be that the use of compressed air, they were blowing air through it, and they had copper bands or aluminum bands, I forget which, surrounding the chassis. The chassis made, well, they wasted a lot of money making it out of Teflon, and then they learned they didn't have to. They could make it out of aluminum and just coat it so that the aluminum chassis was insulated from the other components of the motor. But the chassis was inducing an extra effect, in addition to whatever effect was being produced by the rotors and the stators. And that was augmenting an electrostatic field surrounding the electromagnetic field, or dynamism that was going on inside the motor itself. And that electrostatic field was improving performance of the electromagnetic motor. So my guess is that if you spin a piece of metal fast enough, yeah, it induces its own Lenz effect. You know, all these little experiments with magnets and aluminum or copper, in which the aluminum or copper don't have any ferromagnetic qualities of their own, yet if you move a magnet in their vicinity, it induces movement in the aluminum or the copper near the magnet. The explanation being that an electric current is being formed, which means a magnetic field is also being formed. Now, the fact the way they stated it, electric current is being formed first, means that the so-called back EMF being formed is a magnetic field in drag. It's dragging, it's lagging behind in terms of time. It's not responding right away. There's a little pause before it can build up sufficient force and reach its peak of what it's going to do. Is a little behind what already happened with the electric field. Let's see what else. So this implies that in an electrostatic field which has no geometry to it, in the purest sense imaginable, a pure electrostatic field would have no geometry to it. And the difference between an electrostatic field and an electromagnetic field is that the electromagnetic field has geometry. We start to define some semblance of geometry so that we can say, oh, the electric field has a shape to it because the electric current has a shape to it. Normally we say, well, the electric current has a loop, makes it a closed circuit. That's a geometry. But if we simply have a point inducing a field in which we don't have a geometry of movement, we have a purely electrostatic field because there's no movement. So there's no movement, there's no shorting of the field, creating movement, defining a geometry in which we have a well-defined electric field and magnetic field, in which we do have geometry. That's electromagnetic dynamics, as opposed to electrostatics, which has no geometry whatsoever, and it's just there. It's a charged state induced in some material, or in... Well, we can't say space because we can't measure it in space, right? We have to put a meter there, and the meter is material. So there's really no such thing as a charged space per se. We don't know it. For all practical intents and purposes, we don't know it. It might be there. You know, Eric Dollard would say, oh yeah, it's there. It's in counter space. Well, regardless, for all practical purposes, we don't know that. So, in terms of just what we know, trying to keep it simple here, the analysis simple and not getting too digressed into all of the numerous deep details that Eric Dollard could get into. I can't go there, so I'll try to lop it off before we even go there into the square root of -1 imaginary fields. I don't even want to deal with imaginary numbers. So, in terms of geometry, which has to do with space, right? It doesn't have to do with counter space. So, in terms of geometry, an electrostatic field, there has to be a shape to turn it into an electromagnetic field, which implies there has to be a short, creating a geometry. A short is a shape. And without the short, we don't even have the beginning of a closed circuit. And if the short is in the form of a loop, then we have an electromagnetic dynamics. We have an electric field and we have a magnetic field. So now we have a spinning piece of aluminum, a disk, composing a disk. You know, it might have been square, but when it starts spinning, it defines in time a disk. I don't have to say anything more. I don't want to. And it has an axis of spin. That's the only geometry, in a sense. Or no, excuse me. The only geometry that does not exist is the axis of spin. Because this plane of spin is the geometry, a loop, in which we have an electric field And if it spins fast enough, the magnetic field can't catch up. And that's what's happening with the Searle disk. It reaches a point, still unbeknownst to my awareness of how it operates. I'm just talking in broad generalities here. But there is some detail that has to do with how much does the magnetic field drag behind the electric before it reaches a point at which the Searle effect, or the Searle spinning disk, empowers itself to create its own source of power, so now it accelerates on its own and reaches, God knows what RPM it can reach all on its own. But it accelerates, it self-accelerates, and at the same time induces anti-gravity with respect to the Earth, using the Earth as a reference. Because we could have, one can postulate that if anti-gravity goes far enough, does the Searle disk explode? Didn't Tesla test thin wire with high voltage? And if the wire was thin enough and the voltage was high enough, the wire would explode. It would vaporize. So, we could fantasize that the Searle disk just goes out into space and travels indefinitely. No. Eventually it explodes. It vaporizes. And that's probably why gases compose the substance of interstellar space that's not creating a gravitational field. In other words, it's not in a state of rotation. So in a sense, the explosion cancels the rotation. At that point, the acceleration vamooses so fast, there's no way to stop it. What are you going to stop it with? It's like these banzai drivers in the middle of the night on the freeway, and the police say, hey, they drive so fast, we just let them alone. There's no way we're going to chase them. There's no way we want to get involved. So the only way to break it is to have the thing vaporize. What does the I Ching say? The I Ching doesn't say how, it just says when something gets extreme enough, it flips into its opposite. So if a Searle disk, it manages to self-accelerate all on its own, eventually it has to stop spinning because it vaporizes and instantaneously loses the integrity of its metallic disk that was creating the magnetic drag and the electric field lead and the anti-gravity that went along with it. So now all of a sudden it explodes, and all of that comes to a dead stop instantaneously. Cuts off. It applied its own brakes. So this is something to keep in mind. There are limits. We cannot take free energy all the way, and we know that because there are certain devices, and I don't remember the names of it, but I remember one. It was a tiny little unit, probably no bigger than my fist, and you literally could time it based on how long it would last before it just melts down and fries itself, because it had no means of controlling the self-acceleration of power that it created. Once you started it, it was not self-starting. Searle disk is not self-starting. You have to start it rotating with a regular gasoline motor to get it up to a minimum RPM before it starts to self-accelerate. So this device was something similar. It was some kind of an electromagnetic device with a magnet maybe and coils. I can't remember. And the thing literally fried, because it would reach a point at which it just, the CLP was like in the millions. But then it would just suffer meltdown and come to a dead halt. So this is the I Ching in operation here. When something gets extreme enough, it flips into its opposite. Acceleration comes to a dead stop if we don't manage to control it. And that might be what freaked out Marvin Cole, was because he got into something that was self-accelerating. The anti-gravity was just a side effect, indicating that something was self-accelerating beyond his emotional ability to start to beg the question, okay, now how do I control this wild stallion that's, can't sit still and only gets more wild. Let's see, what else? So he freaked out and left the project. Meanwhile, Richard Hackenberger comes along, can't replicate what Marvin Cole was doing, except take the tail end of it and learn to control it. So unfortunately, those two guys should have worked together. They would have come up with a really cool deal, because they would have been able to pick at what rate do they want the EV Gray motor to self-accelerate and hold it there. I bet the two of them would have been able to figure that out. You know, they could have picked and chosen whatever COP they wanted. Literally, dial a COP. Oh, you want a COP of this? Fine, you can have it. And they would have figured out how to regulate and manage it. Because they had two completely opposite, apparently, mentalities that would have intermeshed so perfectly. They would have created a designer's EV Gray motor, custom made to whatever calibration you want it to perform to. That's what you get. And poor EV Gray's in the middle and he's scratching his head and doesn't know a darn thing what's going on. Except he knows how to sell it. The man in the middle who's caught with these two guys who can't who never knew each other face to face. Talk about the most... It shows there was no karma, there was no grace, good karma, to make it happen. It just wasn't there. It just wasn't there. And we're scratching our heads wondering why. Well, we didn't deserve it. It was not our time. Our collective grace just didn't deserve it. It's because Hackenberger and Cole didn't even know each other. Yet they're a perfect match. And poor Evie Gray was very poor with people management. He could sell you something, but nobody could get along with him. So really, you needed a fourth person to get in there and draw them together. Because the whole... to draw them together. And Evie Gray was the last person to draw anybody together. So, it shows, you can study these free energy devices all you like, but if you don't study the people interactions, you may lose it. I mean, unless you get with a one-man band like Tesla who can do it all, but he couldn't create his own financing. So you see, you really do need this fourth element of people management to be able to understand the people dynamics, or else the whole thing falls apart and nothing happens. All right. So this is my analysis of the Searle Disk based on my little interaction with somebody who, I don't know who he is. And it's the Lenz effect is no big deal because everybody else is dealing with it. It's like, okay, so what? It's because nobody's analyzing that we can do something in a DC situation that mimics what can be done in an AC. It's harder to create, but it's more beneficial if you can create it. And that's time drag. The effect of a drag over time that you can use to your advantage. Obviously. And Marvin Cole freaked out creating it. Didn't know he had something that was an asset. And instead, he just freaked out. Instead of being able to handle it. Well, he was a newbie. That was back in, late 60s or something that he created it, or very early 70s. I think, the way Mark McKay wrote out the timeline, I think it was like 71 or 72. Things were happening really fast when things started to break down. Let's see if there's anything else I haven't covered. I don't think so. I think that's it. So, those are my thoughts. Here's another hypothesis for you. It should be obvious to us what the nature of Tesla's trimetal generator is, because we already know that copper is diamagnetic, aluminum is paramagnetic, and iron is ferromagnetic. Yet it still eludes us. Yet it should be obvious. So let's take what I just said and now apply this next additional piece of information. If diamagnetic implies an attraction to a magnetic field, and para means repulsion, that's already implying how copper and aluminum separately behave with this lag effect of the Lenz effect. In other words, they're opposite. Apparently ferromagnetic, there's no lag. The magnetic field and the electric field are matched in a ferromagnetic material, the behavior of the Lenz effect. So in each one, there's a difference of time, whether we have a lag or not, and if we do, which way does it go? So we get three possibilities. So if there is no lag, no drag, that's ferromagnetic. It's a match. The two are in sync. And so it behaves like a magnet. It creates a magnetic field. But copper and aluminum don't do that. They don't create a magnetic field because there's a lag. But they lag in opposite ways, I bet. It's just speculation, hypothetical. Just not even hypothetical much of. It's mostly speculation with very little hypothesis to support it. A little bit. A thin film of hypothesis to support it. So, if copper is diamagnetic, it attracts a magnetic field. You would think that the magnetic field leads when it's induced in copper, and the electric field drags. While with aluminum, it's the opposite. The magnetic field drags, and the electric field leads. Because it's paramagnetic, it's repelling. Aluminum is repelling a magnetic field. That means it would drag. It wouldn't be in any hurry to catch up. He always go, no. You go ahead, electric field. You go ahead. I'll follow after you. And somebody said on a YouTube video, if we know how to deal with these three different magnetic effects, we could probably create all kinds of interesting results, such as anti-gravity. Well, he was right, but it's like we're still scratching our heads though over that. We're like doing the caveman scratch, like or the Tim Allen caveman, whatever. So that's what I would add to that little theory. What the difference is between copper, aluminum, and iron. It has to do with the Lenz effect and how we define drag in each of those three material substances. Just a thought. So to repeat this hypothesis, in aluminum, the electric field leads the magnetic field which drags, while in copper it may be the opposite, in which the magnetic field leads and the electric field drags. So, since the Earth's surface as we know it is composed of an aluminosilicate material, implying, first of all, that the silica there is a dielectric to hold the charge, or slow it down, I suppose. And the aluminum, it will be exhibiting an electric field that leads the magnetic field, thus causing it to automatically have properties that are anti-gravity or levitational, thus implying that's why the shell of the Earth is an aluminosilicate material, so that it can buoy itself or levitate itself away from the core of the Earth and the space between them, the very large space between them, because the core should be relatively small. If the core, yet we have magma, iron magma, underneath the aluminosilicate surface. So we've got iron in the center and aluminosilicate on the surface. So what if the core is similarly composed of an iron combined, though, with copper, in which now the core of the planet is producing a field combination in which the electric field is lagging and the magnetic field is leading, which would cause it to create a gravitational field pulling on the shell of the Earth, as opposed to the surface of the Earth or shell of the Earth levitating away from its gravitational center. Now, according to the discussion on an energetic forum that I responded to somebody, this would imply that the surface of the Earth is a diode and the core of the Earth is a diode, but their polarity is reversed. And considering where we don't even have a circuit, or do we? Where's the circuit? It would have to be the interaction of the two geometries, the shell versus the core. And let's see now. In the aluminum-iron combination, the electric flow is from the aluminum to the iron, but it's within the shell itself. So what's the relationship between the shell and the core? Well, we're left with only two things, gravity versus anti-gravity. Being the composite total, sum total, each one, of the interaction between the electric field and the magnetic field in each situation, whether one is leading or the other dragging or vice versa. So in a sense, gravity and anti-gravity is a complex of forces involving electric fields and magnetic fields over time. Their movement through space over time and how they differ. This might be why we haven't been able to create a unified field theory about gravity, because we've been looking at it all wrong. That it doesn't involve, for all intents and purposes, the weak or strong nuclear reactions. It simply involves electromagnetism over time. That's the thing we've been missing, over time. Okay.